Good morning, friends. I welcome you all to this third day of the online classes for MA Part 2, third semester English syllabus prescribed by Rashtrasan Tukroj Maharaj, Nagpur University, Nagpur, organized jointly by Rajkumar Keval Ramani Kanya Mahavidyalaya Patka, Nagpur, Vasantrao Naik Government Institute of Arts and Social Sciences, Nagpur, and J.M. Patel Arts, Commerce and Science College, Bhandara. The topic for the session, beginning with the second compulsory paper, that is literary criticism, and session are the works of Aristotle, the Poetics, Longinus on the Sublime. Person for the day for the session is Dr. Yeah. Sir is working as an assistant professor of English at Vasantrao Naik Government Institute of Arts and Social Sciences, Nagpur. He has been teaching undergraduate as well as postgraduate classes since 2000. The topic of his research work, of his doctoral research, was Vijay Tendulkar's plays, and has published 17 papers, reputed journals and conference proceedings. His areas of interest are Indian English drama and Indian English poetry. So on behalf of the organizers, I welcome sir to this session and hand over the mic to him for presentation. Over to you, sir. You can see your screen now.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words. Good morning, everyone. Sir, am I audible?
Yeah, you are audible.
I will just share my screen.
Yeah, share your screen.
Sir, is the first slide visible?
Yes, okay. Screen is shared.
Okay, sir. So, good morning, students, once again. My topic is Aristotle's The Poetics, and I will also talk about On the Sublime by Longinus. Now, the Poetics by Aristotle is one of the most important works in criticism. It is a very widely discussed work. Aristotle has used certain concepts like catharsis, hamartia, peripety, anagnorisis in this work, and these concepts are being discussed even today. They are being interpreted and reinterpreted even today. This work, the Poetics, was written around 330 BC. And if you look at Aristotle's birth, he was born in 384 BC. So almost 2500 years ago. And he died in 322 BC. Aristotle numbers among the greatest philosophers of all time. A prodigious researcher and writer, he left a great body of work, perhaps numbering as many as 200 treatises, from which approximately 31 survive. So Aristotle was a man of towering intellect. It is said that he had written books on almost all the subjects which were being studied in his time. And he has almost 200 books to his credit, but only 31 have survived. Others have been lost in the course of time. Then what are the different subjects on which he has written? He has written on literature, criticism, and also on logic, metaphysics, philosophy of mind, ethics, political theory, aesthetics, and rhetoric. Though the precise origins of Aristotle's Poetics are not known, researchers believe that the work was composed around 330 BC. An interesting thing to note about the Poetics is that Aristotle himself did not write down the book. He was giving information to his students, and his students were taking notes. And these notes have survived. Of course, they were in Greek language, and afterwards they were translated into English. So, despite its vague beginnings, the Poetics has been a central document in the study of literature for centuries. Now, before beginning to study the Poetics by Aristotle, we must talk about Aristotle's teacher Plato and Plato's book, The Republic. It is because Aristotle's The Poetics is a covert reply to Plato. Covert means indirect. There are three great philosophers in ancient Greece: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And they are bound by this tradition of master and disciple. So, Socrates was the teacher of Plato, and Plato is the teacher of Aristotle. Aristotle is the disciple of Plato. So, let's talk about Plato first. Plato was born in 428 BC and he had died in 348 BC. As I already told you, he was Aristotle's teacher. Plato had his own teaching school by the name Academy. Plato was trying to turn the Greek young men into fit rulers and other administrative officers in an ideal state. So Plato had a specific aim in front of him when he was teaching his students in the academy. He wanted to turn the Greek young men into fit rulers or fit officers who will be beneficial for the state, for the kingdom. Then Plato made a very controversial claim about poets and poetry. Plato declared that poets and poetry have no place in an ideal kingdom. He banished poets and poetry from his ideal kingdom, ideal state. He gave some reasons for banishing poetry. First of all, he said that poetry gives rise to vices. By reading and studying poetry, the young men can instill some vices among themselves. His second charge against poets was that they tell lies about gods. They tell lies about gods. They speak against religion. Thirdly, Plato said that poetry appeals to the baser instincts of human beings. It it causes unhealthy emotions or unhealthy ideas in the minds of the readers. Another famous statement by Plato is that poetry is twice removed from reality. Try to understand this. Plato said poetry is twice removed from reality. Why did Plato say such a thing? According to Plato, God created this world. Before creating the world, the idea of the world was formed in God's mind. So, the idea in God's mind about the world is the real world. And the world which was created by God was a copy of that idea. Okay, so God's idea is the real world, and the actual world is the copy of God's idea, according to Plato. Then what do the poets do? They write about the world, they copy the world. So the poets are making a copy of the copy. And in this way, poetry is twice removed from reality. So such was Plato's charge against poetry. And as we said earlier, he banished poets from ideal kingdom. But there is another reason also behind why Plato did this. So it is because poetry was coming into conflict with his aim of converting the young Greek men into capable rulers and capable officers. He thought that by reading and studying poetry, youth will be led astray. They will uh, lose their capacity for becoming ideal citizens of the Greek city state. So perhaps because of that main reason, and then certain other charges which he brought against poetry, Plato banished poetry from his ideal kingdom. And Aristotle was the disciple of Plato. Aristotle did not agree with the ideas of his master. He did not agree that poetry is a bad thing and poets should be banished from his ideal kingdom. So, Aristotle's work, the Poetics, is a reply to the charges of Plato against poetry. That is why we earlier said that the Poetics is a covert reply to Plato. Aristotle is not directly mentioning Plato anywhere, but he is presenting his ideas in such a manner that all the charges of Plato against poetry are being answered. Then the Poetics is a lopsided work. Why we say that it is a lopsided work? Because the Poetics deals mainly with Aristotle's concept of tragedy. Actually, Aristotle talked about four types of poetry in this book: tragedy, epic, comedy, and satire. But most of this book is devoted to a discussion of tragedy. There is some discussion of epic, and comedy and satire are not discussed in the Poetics. Some scholars suggest that the Poetics, which has survived through the time, is not a complete work. It had a second part, and in the second part, Aristotle had dealt with comedy and satire, but it has been lost in the course of time. So, whatever the case may be, we can say that the Poetics is a lopsided work because it deals mainly with Aristotle's concept of tragedy, and the other genres of poetry are not discussed in detail. The Poetics is Aristotle's attempt to prove the value and significance of poetry. He both defines art and offers criteria for determining the quality of a given artwork. The Poetics stands in opposition to the theory of art propounded by Aristotle's teacher Plato. In his Republic, Plato argues that poetry is a representation of mere appearances and is thus misleading and morally suspect. In the Poetics, Aristotle, Plato's disciple, attempts to refute his teacher by exploring what unites all poetry: its imitative nature and its ability to bring an audience into specific plot while preserving a unity of purpose and theme. Earlier we had said that Plato charged poetry of being twice removed from reality because it was making a copy of the copy. But Aristotle argued that poets do not make a copy of the copy. Poets write about what may happen according to the laws of probability and necessity. Poets don't write about what is actually happening, but about what may happen. So there is an element of creative imagination, creative representation. The poets are presenting the world in a creative manner by mixing their imagination in their idea of the world. So they are not making a copy of the world at all. The next point which we have to see is Aristotle's classification of fine arts and his theory of mimesis. This word mimesis means imitation. So imitation is making a copy of something. According to Aristotle, poetry is one of the fine arts along with other arts like painting, sculpture, music, or dancing. So all these are fine arts: poetry, sculpture, painting, dancing, etc. Then what is the difference between them? How do we differentiate one fine art from another fine art? So the difference is in three things: the medium of imitation, the object of imitation, and the manner of imitation. You can remember this easily by uh, presenting it as MOM of imitation, mom of imitation, you can say. MOM of imitation. So first M is medium, second O is object, and third M is manner of imitation. So let's talk about medium of imitation first. For a sculptor, the medium of imitation is the stone or metal with which he creates his statues or other works. So for a sculptor, that stone is the medium. And in the case of poetry, words, language, rhythm, and harmony, these are the medium of imitation. Poetry is presented through the medium of language, words. So this is how Aristotle differentiates poetry from other fine arts in how it imitates through the medium of language. Secondly, Aristotle talks about object of imitation. In poetry, the object of imitation are human beings doing something or experiencing something. We can say human beings in action. So poetry represents human beings as doing something, doing some action, or experiencing some emotion. Poetry can imitate human beings in different ways. The poet can present human beings as better than they are in actual life, or as worse than they are in actual life, or he can present them as they actually are. But the third possibility is not discussed in detail by Aristotle. He concentrates on how poetry represents men as either better than they actually are or worse than they actually are. And this gives rise to the different types of poetry. When people are presented as better than they are, it results in tragedy and epic. When human beings are presented as worse than they are, it results in comedy and satire. So, this is how Aristotle explains the objects of imitation of poetry. As poetry imitates men as either better or worse than they are, it is not a mere mimicry or servile copy, but an act of creative imagination. It is about possibilities. Thus, Aristotle defends poetry from Plato's charge that it is twice removed from reality. Comedy represents men as worse than they are, tragedy as better than they are in actual life. The third thing is the manner of imitation. So, poets are imitating through the medium of language. They are imitating human beings as either better or worse than they actually are. But what is the manner of imitation? A poet can imitate either through narration, in which he takes another personality, an omniscient eye watching the events like an observer. Secondly, the poet can speak in his own person, unchanged, the first person I. And thirdly, he presents all his characters as living and moving before us, that is, dramatic representation on stage. So basically, manner of imitation available to poet is either he can narrate or he can represent dramatically on the stage. So here again, the narrative manner of imitation gives rise to epic and satire. If the poet is imitating through narration and he is presenting men as better than they are, it results in epic. If the poet is imitating through narration and presenting men as lower than they are, it results in satire. And when the poet is presenting men as better than they are and presenting them on the stage through actors performing the characters, the dramatic method, it results in tragedy. And if the narrative mode is used, then it results in epic. So see how Aristotle is scientifically presenting all these aspects of poetry. He seems to be a very close observer. He seems to have this knack of classifying and analyzing things like a scientist. And this is how he presents all his analysis of poetry in front of us. Then Aristotle talks about the reasons of emergence of poetry. Why did poetry emerge? It is because of two reasons. Man's instinct to imitate things and the instinct for harmony and rhythm. So imitating somebody is a natural instinct in human beings. You can take the example of small children or monkeys. They are fond of imitating. The small children imitate, copy anybody. It is only when they start growing up and they are scolded for their activity, they stop the imitation. So that imitation is basic in human nature. And then when human beings see imitation, it gives pleasure to them. They can understand new things through imitation. The harmony and rhythm which is used in imitation gives pleasure to human beings. So because of these reasons, uh, poetry emerged as a mode of imitation. Once poetry emerged, it evolved in two directions. One group of poets imitated noble actions, and the second group imitated the actions of meaner persons in the form of satire. So this is how tragedy and comedy and epic and satire evolved. Then Aristotle talks about the similarities and differences between epic and tragedy. Epic uses the narrative form, whereas tragedy uses the dramatic form. According to Aristotle, tragedy is superior to epic as it contains all the elements of epic plus spectacle and song, two additional elements. Actually, Aristotle talks about six elements of a tragedy: plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. We will talk about that a little later. Just now, you just remember that tragedy contains all the elements of the epic and two additional elements, spectacle and song. Epic poetry imitates men of noble action, like tragedy. But epic poetry only allows the use of one kind of meter and is narrative in form. Moreover, tragedy usually confines itself to a single day, whereas epic poetry has no limits of time. This reference by Aristotle to the general practice of his times was misinterpreted as his insistence on unity of time and unity of place. But we have to understand that Aristotle only insisted on unity of action. See what happened here. Aristotle said that tragedy should be confined to a single day. Aristotle was talking about the time for which an audience can sit at one place and watch the drama. People can't sit at one place for many days together and watch the drama. They will be able to sit for 3, 4, or 5 hours at the most. So the tragedy, the drama has to be finished during that time. This is what Aristotle had meant, but it was misinterpreted by certain critics of later times, and they said that Aristotle suggests that uh, the actions of the tragedy should take place in the same time as the tragedy is presented, or that all the actions of the tragedy should take place at the same place. But that was not what Aristotle had suggested. It was only misrepresentation of his ideas in later times. So we have discussed here Aristotle's theory of mimesis, how he talks about the three modes of imitation: medium of imitation, manner of imitation, and object of imitation. So now we come to the most important part of the book, The Poetics, Aristotle's definition of tragedy. This is the definition of tragedy by Aristotle. He says, tragedy is the imitation of an action, serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in a language beautified in different parts with different kinds of embellishment, through action and not narration, and through scenes of pity and fear, bringing about the catharsis of these or such like emotions. I will repeat the definition. Tragedy, according to Aristotle, is the imitation of an action, serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in a language beautified in different parts with different kinds of embellishment, through action and not narration, and through scenes of pity and fear, bringing about the catharsis of these or such like emotions. In this definition, Aristotle has talked about the tragedy's medium, object, and manner of imitation. He has also explained the function and emotional effects of a tragedy. So let's try to understand this definition, the words in this definition one by one. First of all, Aristotle says that tragedy is the imitation. Yes, it is imitation of an action which is serious. So tragedy imitates serious action. In the case of comedy, some lighter, some frivolous actions will be imitated. In tragedy, serious actions of noble men are imitated. Complete. This action in the tragedy is complete. It means the action in the tragedy has a beginning, a middle, and an end. The action is complete in itself. Before watching the tragedy, the audience does not need any prior information. The beginning of the tragedy is self-explanatory. The middle naturally follows the incidents of the beginning, and the end naturally follows the incidents of the middle. So the natural progression, beginning, middle, and end, and the action is complete. This action is of a certain magnitude. So the tragedy is neither too short nor too long. Here Aristotle gives an interesting example. Aristotle says that think about two organisms. One organism is microscopic, so tiny that you can watch it only through the microscope. Another organism is so large that his body spreads to thousands of kilometers. You can't see him in one glance. So one animal is too small and one is too large. You cannot understand their beauty in a single glance properly. So similarly, a tragedy too short or too long will not give a proper impression. We can say that Aristotle is thinking about tragedy in organic terms here. He says that tragedy should have a certain magnitude. Compared to epic, it will be shorter because epic is in narrative form. So the narration can stop and start and it can go on for a long time. But the tragedy is to be presented on the stage. So it should be long enough only so that people can watch it in one sitting. But again, it should not be too short also. The proper beginning, middle, and end, those things should happen there. So that is what Aristotle means by the action should be of a certain magnitude. Then Aristotle said in this definition, in a language beautified in different parts with different kinds of embellishment. The language of the tragedy is beautified with different kinds of ornaments, you can say. There will be use of figures of speech, appropriate language will be used for appropriate situations. If a common man is speaking, the language will be different. If a king or a general is speaking, the language will be different. It will be appropriate to the situation. Then there will be use of figures of speech or in short, beautified language. And this beautification of language also gives pleasure. It enhances the beauty of the tragedy. Through action and not narration. Narration is for the epic. In tragedy, action is presented on the stage. And through scenes of pity and fear. Now Aristotle is talking about the function of tragedy. What is the function of tragedy? It presents scenes of pity and fear, bringing about the catharsis of these or such like emotions. According to Aristotle, the events depicted in the tragedy create the feelings of excuse me events depicted in a tragedy create the feelings of pity and fear in the minds of the audience or reader if it is being read. Tragedy depicts the fall of a hero, the tragic hero, from lofty heights. This hero is a good man, but he has certain flaw or he makes certain mistake, an error of judgment, and because of that the hero suffers a downfall. So we feel pity for the hero. We feel pity that he has been punished more than what he deserved. So we feel pity for him. The tragedy also creates the feeling of fear in the mind of the audience. While watching the tragedy, the audience identifies itself with the tragic hero. They feel that the tragic hero is a person like them, having the human weaknesses, frailties, likes and dislikes just like them. And a person like them is suffering this downfall. So what is happening to the tragic hero may happen to them also. This is what the audience feels. And so they feel fear. So this is how tragedy arouses the emotions of pity and fear in the minds of the audience. And it brings about the catharsis of these emotions. Catharsis or purgation. Intense feelings of pity and fear are created in the mind of the audience, and then they are given a release, a sort of outlet, by watching the tragedy on the stage or by reading about it. So the feelings of pity and fear are roused and they are calmed also. After watching the tragedy, the audience experiences a kind of calm. They have spent these emotions of pity and fear. So it has this cathartic effect. This is what Aristotle means by catharsis. That there are these excessive emotions of pity, fear, and other negative emotions in the minds of human beings, and by watching the tragedy, these emotions are given an outlet. So this is a positive effect, beneficial effect of tragedy. Remember what Plato had said. Plato had said that poetry gives rise to vices. It has a negative influence on human beings. But Aristotle is suggesting that tragedy has a positive effect, a beneficial effect. These excessive emotions of pity and fear are purged. This cathartic effect is a uh, beneficial effect of the tragedy. So this is how Aristotle establishes the value and significance of poetry. This is how he answers the charge of his master Plato against poetry. Aristotle shows that poetry has good effects on the audience, not bad effects. So what Plato was saying about the poets could be a case of some poets misusing poetry. If some poets are writing bad poetry, because of them, all poets cannot be banned from the ideal kingdom. This is the position which Aristotle appears to be taking in his work, the Poetics. So I have talked about the definition of tragedy here, and I have tried to explain the different uh, words of this definition. And we have seen that Aristotle perceives the effects of the tragedy to be pleasurable and beneficial. Repressing emotions of pity and fear can have negative effects, but tragedy gives outlet to these repressed emotions. Now we will talk about the six elements of tragedy, the six parts that define a tragedy. So according to Aristotle, a tragedy has six formative parts. They are plot, character, thoughts, diction, song, song or melody, and spectacle. Let's discuss them one by one. First and the most important element of tragedy, according to Aristotle, is plot. Now, plot, according to Aristotle, is the life and soul of a tragedy. Plot is the life and soul of a tragedy. In an ideal tragic plot, the action is whole, it is complete, it has a beginning, middle, and an end. Aristotle says that it is not necessary for the tragedian to begin with the hero's birth. It is just that the beginning of the tragedy should be self-explanatory and no prior knowledge should be required from the audience. The middle should naturally and inevitably follow beginning, and the end of the catastrophe should naturally follow the middle. Then Aristotle has talked about the kinds of plot. So according to Aristotle, plot of a tragedy can be simple or complex. Before we go to the discussion of simple and complex plot, let's see some other information about the plot. So according to Aristotle, plot is the most important part of a tragedy for a number of reasons. First, the result of a man's actions determines his success or failure, and hence his happiness. So, it is action which is paramount, not character. Aristotle subordinates character to plot. According to Aristotle, plot is more important than characterization in a tragedy. Without action, there cannot be tragedy, but there can be a tragedy without character. This is a statement made by Aristotle in the Poetics. Thirdly, diction, song, and thought, even elegantly combined, cannot replicate the action of life without plot. So, plot is the soul of a tragedy, and character comes second. So, we have already talked about the magnitude of a tragedy, or how unity refers to the centering of all the plot's action around a common theme or idea. Determinate structure refers to the fact that the plot hinges on a sequence of causal imitative events. So, if one were to remove even one part of the plot, the entire tragedy will be disjointed and disturbed. Try to understand this. Aristotle compares the plot of a tragedy with the body of an animal. You can't remove even one small part of an animal's body without causing injury to the animal. Similarly, in an ideal tragic plot, no incident or dialogue can be removed from the tragedy without disturbing the tragedy as a whole. Everything in the tragedy, every action, every dialogue has its own importance. Universality refers to the necessity of a given character to speak or act according to how all or most humans would react in a given situation, according to the laws of probability or necessity. Here, Aristotle suggests that the plot should present the actions of the characters which follow the principle of universality. The characters in a tragedy should behave in such a way that even ordinary human beings behave in life. The character's behavior should be identifiable with the actual human behavior. Aristotle ends his discussion of plot by pointing out his particular disdain for episodic plots, plots in which episodes succeed one another without probability or necessary sequence. There are certain episodic kind of plots in which the principle of beginning, middle, and end are not followed, and Aristotle does not endorse such type of plots. Now Aristotle discusses the two types of plots, simple and complex. And while discussing this, he has talked about two words, peripety and anagnorisis. The meaning of peripety is reversal. The meaning of anagnorisis is recognition. According to Aristotle, a complex plot has the elements of peripety and recognition, and a simple plot does not have elements of peripety and recognition. In a simple plot, the action moves forward without any change of direction. So, for example, the hero's fortunes start falling downward and they go on downwards. No change in the direction. In a complex plot, the hero's fortunes rise up to a certain point and then start falling rapidly downwards. So, in a complex plot, the fortunes of the hero keep rising for some time, and then a point of reversal comes and his fortune starts going downwards. Thus, there is an abrupt change of direction in the fortune of the hero in a complex plot. And these two words, peripety and anagnorisis, are connected to this change in the direction. Peripety or reversal is the point from where the hero's fortunes change course and they start falling. The event which begins this fall is the event of peripety, or in simple language, reversal. So, a simple tragedy does not have reversal, recognition, and catharsis, but a complex tragedy has reversal and recognition, and it has the element of catharsis also. Then Aristotle talks about the element of astonishment. Astonishment refers to a tragedy's ability to inspire fear and pity. Both fear and pity are elicited from an audience when the events come by surprise, but not by chance. The surprise that drives the tragedy must feel like it is part of a grander design. Reversal or peripety is the change by which the main action of the story comes full circle. Then recognition or anagnorisis is the change from ignorance to knowledge. So peripety was the reversal, and anagnorisis is the recognition. The hero realizes something. There is a change from ignorance to knowledge, usually involving people coming to understand the identities of one another. Sometimes in a tragedy plot, people don't know their relationship with each other, and then at some point of time the identities are discovered. So that is the recognition part, or discovering whether a person has done a thing or not. So if a person is charged of doing something, then the exact point where the hero discovers whether that person has done that thing or not will be the element of anagnorisis. Suffering is a destructive or painful action which is often the result of reversal or recognition. The tragedy depicts suffering, and this suffering is often the result of these events of reversal or recognition. All tragedies depend on suffering as part of its attempt to elicit pity and fear from the audience. It is the suffering of the tragic hero which creates feelings of pity and fear in the minds of the audience. Catharsis is pity for the hero and fear that his fate could befall us. So we had talked earlier also about this while discussing the definition, that the audience often identifies itself with the tragic hero. They feel pity for the hero because they feel that the hero is being punished much more than what his mistake was. And they fear because they feel that what is happening to the tragic hero may happen to them also. While pity is the result of any combination of reversal and recognition, fear can only be a product of reversal and recognition. Aristotle next addresses what elements comprise the best tragic plots. So, according to Aristotle, the complex plot having the elements of peripety and anagnorisis is perfect for creating the feelings of pity and fear. Complex plot is preferable to a simple plot. And yet a good tragedy does not simply present the spectacle of a virtuous man suffering adversity, for that is merely shocking and does not make us empathize with the hero. Let's try to understand this in some detail. According to Aristotle, in a tragedy, a good man should not be shown as passing from happiness to misery. A good man should not be shown as passing from happiness to misery. Because if that happens, where is the justice in that? Then Aristotle says that a bad man should not be shown as passing from misery to happiness. Because again, if he is a bad person and he is being rewarded, Where is the justice in that? So that is where this tragic hero with a certain defect or flaw comes into point. The tragic hero is neither completely good nor completely bad. He is an average human being, but he commits some mistake, or there is some error of judgment on his part, or there is a defect in his personality which is otherwise good, and because of that particular defect or flaw or error of judgment, the hero suffers a fall. And when this happens, it creates the feelings of pity and fear. So, such a plot of a tragic hero having a certain flaw, and because of that, he's going to a downfall, such a plot, according to Aristotle, is best suited for creating pity and fear in the minds of the audience. If pity is aroused by unmerited misfortune and fear by the misfortune of a man like ourselves, then a good tragedy presents a character whose downfall comes because of a flaw in him, an error or frailty. Though he is renowned, prosperous, even seeming virtuous, there is a chink in his armor that will inevitably be found and will be the source of his demise. And this chink in the armor, this flaw, this defect in the personality of the tragic hero is termed as hamartia. Hamartia is this defect or the error of judgment or the flaw in the character of the tragic hero. Aristotle further says that fear and pity truly can only be elicited through this tragic flaw in the hero, which in turn is motivated by the unity or spine of the entire piece. Some poets, says Aristotle, use spectacle to motivate fear and pity, but this ultimately does not resonate for long, since spectacle produces a different type of pleasure than the one requisite for tragedy. Only pity and fear can produce true purgation of emotions rather than a spectacle of false catharsis. Aristotle next summarizes the circumstances that make for a good tragedy. First, it must involve actions between people who are dear to one another. That is, a son killing a mother or a brother killing a brother. So, Aristotle talks about such incidents which can create the feelings of pity and fear. A close relative killing his another relative. Such incidents can be beneficial or extremely helpful for creating pity and fear. Such acts can be done consciously and with knowledge of the people involved, or the act can be done ignorantly and a tie of family or friendship discovered afterwards. Both options are available to the writer of the tragedy. The act is not done because the hero can't go through with it. Another tragic plot can present probability of such an action, probability of a person killing his close relative, but the action is not done. The act is about to be done, but then the discovery reveals the true identities of the characters, and the deed is stopped before it does irreparable harm. So Aristotle talks about these different ways in which the tragic plot can move forward. Next point is the essentials of characterization according to Aristotle. So he talks about four essentials of characterization. And he also suggests what are the qualifications of a tragic hero. So, firstly, the hero must be good. First requirement from the tragic hero, he must be good. By good, Aristotle means that he should not be a wicked person, he should be a good person, having good in his mind or good intentions. He should manifest moral purpose in his speech. Second essential requirement is a hero must have propriety or manly valor. Propriety. So, hero should represent the quality of manly valor. Thirdly, the hero must be true to life. Third requirement is that the tragic hero's behavior should be like a real person and how he will behave in certain situation. The tragic hero should behave in the same way. So this enables the identification of the audience with the hero. And finally, the hero must be consistent. According to Aristotle, the tragic hero should behave in a consistent manner. For example, if a person is represented as being rash and unthoughtful, that person should act in a rash and unthoughtful way throughout the play, throughout his career. This will show consistency in character. Aristotle also says that if a person is shown to be of inconsistent character, then he should behave inconsistently. That will also maintain that consistency of characterization. The concept of true to life is addressed further, and Aristotle points out that a well-drawn character acts out of probability and necessity, not because of some arbitrary traits bestowed upon him by the author. Next, Aristotle talks about three qualifications of a tragic hero. Firstly, tragic hero should be a person of an intermediate kind. By this, Aristotle means the tragic hero should neither be a wicked person nor a saint. He should be like an ordinary human being, a mixture of good and bad, just like every ordinary human being has some good qualities and bad qualities. So, tragic hero should be a person of intermediate kind, mixture of good and bad. Secondly, the tragic hero should be a highly placed person. The tragic hero should occupy an important position in society. So he could be a king or a prince or a general, but highly placed, a prosperous, popular person who is respected by society. And thirdly, the misfortune of the tragic hero must result from his own actions. The Hamartia element we earlier talked about. The hero suffers downfall in his life because of his own actions. He may be a good person having many good qualities, but he has one defect or he makes one error of judgment, he makes one mistake, and his downfall is the result of that mistake. So that is the hamartia, the tragic flaw or defect in the character of the tragic hero, and it causes his downfall. Aristotle then lists the types of recognition available to a poet. So first there is a recognition by signs, bodily marks, or some things like uh, other marking that delineate the secret identity of a person. Okay, we will come to this afterwards. We can go forward here. During his discussion of tragedy in the work The Poetics, Aristotle compared tragedy with two things. He compared tragedy with history and he compared tragedy with epic. And in both these comparisons, Aristotle showed that tragedy is superior to both history and epic. In the case of history, Aristotle said that history only tells what has happened in the past. Tragedy tells what may happen according to the laws of probability and necessity. History is narrated, whereas tragedy is presented on the stage and we see it through live human beings. According to Aristotle, tragedy is more philosophical and more universal than history. And then towards the end of the Poetics, Aristotle compares epic with tragedy. He concludes by tackling the question of whether the epic or tragic form is the higher. Most critics of his time argued that tragedy was for an inferior audience that required the gesture of performers, while epic poetry was for a cultivated audience which could filter a narrative form through their own imagined characters. So here Aristotle's views differed from the other scholars or critics of his times. The other scholars were of the view that epic is superior to tragedy because epic does not require to be presented on the stage. It is self-sufficient in itself. But Aristotle does not agree with this. He suggests that tragedy is superior to epic. Aristotle replies with the following. Firstly, epic recitation can be marred with overdone gesticulation in the same way as a tragedy. Secondly, tragedy, like poetry, produces its effect without action. Its power is in the mere reading, and performance on the stage should give the exact same effect as reading a good epic love. By this point, Aristotle means that it is not absolutely necessary to present the tragedy on the stage to bring about catharsis of pity and fear. A tragic play, even when it is read, creates the same pity and fear in the mind of the reader. Presentation on the stage is not absolutely necessary. And finally, Aristotle says that the tragedy is superior because it has all the epic elements as well as spectacle and song. So we had seen that tragedy had 6 elements: plot, character, thought, diction, song, and spectacle. Excuse me. Epic has 4 elements: plot, character, thought, diction. The elements of song and spectacle are missing in the epic. So this is the reason Aristotle gives why tragedy is superior to epic. It has all the qualities of an epic and it has something more to offer. A tragedy maintains a vividness of impression in reading as well as staging. So Aristotle concludes his work, the Poetics, by declaring that tragedy, despite the argument of critics of his time that epic is superior, according to Aristotle, tragedy is the higher art and it is superior to epic. Okay, so here I have concluded my discussion of Aristotle's The Poetics. We also have On the Sublime by Longinus in this unit. So I will try to deal with On the Sublime in a short manner in this lecture only. Let's move to Longinus's On the Sublime. So Longinus, his full name is Cassius Longinus. Cassius Longinus, and Longinus is a 3rd century Greek scholar of the Roman era. He belongs to the 3rd century AD. On the Sublime is a treatise on aesthetics and literary criticism, originally written in Greek between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD. The author is not definitively known, but the text is typically credited with the name of Longinus. So there is some confusion or controversy here. It is suggested that Longinus, who belongs to the 3rd century, is the author of On the Sublime. But there is another group of scholars who suggest that On the Sublime was written much earlier, probably in the 1st century. So Longinus of 3rd century could not have been the author. It may be some other Longinus. So definite answer to this controversy is not known, and we can go with the general view that Longinus, Cassius Longinus of the 3rd century is the writer of On the Sublime. Although the work has come to be known as On the Sublime in English, its subject is advice to writers on the essentials of a noble and impressive style. This work on the Sublime gives advice to writers on how they can develop a noble and impressive style. One theory about Longinus states that he may have avoided publishing his own writing so as to preserve his modesty and moral excellence, a decision that might explain On the Sublime's uncertain authorship. So basically, this work on the Sublime is about qualities of great writing. Longinus says that there are certain features which differentiate great writing from average or mediocre writing. So how can a writer make his writing great? What are these characteristic features of great writing? On the Sublime is uh, a work of literature which is sublime, which can give pleasure, which can teach also, and which can persuade also. Three qualities are available in a sublime work of literature. It teaches, it delights, and it persuades also. Now, according to Longinus, the following 5 factors are responsible for achieving sublimity in writing, for achieving greatness in writing. First is greatness of thought or vigorous mental conception. Great thought, in short. Second is intensity of emotion, strong and inspired emotion. Third factor is appropriate use of figures of speech. Fourth factor, which contributes to sublimity, nobility of diction, that is word choice and use of figurative language. And the fifth factor, according to Longinus, is a dignified and distinguished word arrangement. He also calls it harmonious development. So the first factor is greatness of thought. According to Longinus, when a writer has great thoughts in his mind, when he has firm grasp on ideas, then these great thoughts are carried over to the work which he writes, and it contributes to greatness of writing. Secondly, the writer should be inspired. He should have an intensity of emotion. Thirdly, the writer should make appropriate use of figures of speech in his writing. It contributes to greatness. Fourth factor is noble diction. Here, Longinus means that proper verbal order, rhythm, and harmony are to be maintained by a writer. Noble diction, proper diction is to be used. And the fifth factor is a combination of the four above factors. A harmonious presentation. When a writer has a great thought and inspired emotion and proper use of figures of speech, noble diction, then the combination of these factors results in a harmonious development, harmonious presentation of the subject matter. And these qualities make a work of art great. To further his argument, Longinus analyzes examples of both strong and weak writing from works written over the previous 1,000 years. Now, Longinus has given examples of works written in previous 1,000 years from his time. So he has given examples from writers such as Homer, Plato, Sappho, Aristophanes, Demosthenes, and Cicero. And he has also given examples from the book of Genesis from the Bible. Longinus describes greatness in writing as a combination of innate genius and learned skill. A great writer must also possess and exhibit moral excellence. Another thing which you should know about on the Sublime is that it is written in epistolary form, in the form of a letter. The work on the Sublime is a letter written by Longinus to his friend, whose name was Postumius Terentianus, a cultured Roman personality of the 3rd century. So Longinus was writing a letter to his friend and he was discussing these elements of great writing. On the Sublime is in epistolary form. Longinus writes to his friend about the principles of great writing. He says that great writing should take the reader out of himself. Great writing is capable of taking the reader out of himself, moving him, impressing him with power and emotion. Great writers must have both natural talent and disciplined training. They must use figures of speech and rhetorical devices wisely, arranging their words with care, artistry, and avoiding stylistic excess and false emotion. They must express sincere passion and in doing so excite the same emotions in their readers. Literary rules give both structure and aesthetic beauty to our writing. But although rules are important, a great genius can break the rules to achieve a higher purpose or to express a particularly strong emotion. So Longinus gives freedom to the writer. He does not believe in just copying the rules of the ancient classic writers. He gives importance to the individuality of the writer. In this sense, Longinus has been called as the first great romantic critic. The romantic critics of early 19th century like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, their ideas and the ideas of Longinus are similar to some extent, which is why Longinus has been called as the first great romantic critic. Imitating the great literary geniuses of the past, such as Homer or Demosthenes, is a valid way for the writer to achieve greatness, according to Longinus. Above all, the great writer must possess a moral high-mindedness that will shine forth and influence readers to be morally good as well. Great writing also depends on the social framework an individual lives in. Freedom is necessary in a society to foster literary greatness, because without it we are slaves of passion and lose all sense of value. An interesting thing of on the Sublime is that Longinus also talks about false sublime in this work. He says that there is a true sublime and there is a false sublime. True sublime results from the earlier 5 qualities we discussed: great thought, great emotion, and the 3 other elements. False sublime, according to Longinus, is a result of certain factors, such as when the writer indulges in making a show off, when the writer makes use of pompous and bombastic words, it results in false sublime. When there is a lack of sense or maturity in the writer, a lack of genuine ideas, a sort of childishness, so lack of good emotions gives rise to false sublime. According to Longinus, if a work is not able to give pleasure, if it is not able to persuade the reader, then it is suffering from the fault of false sublime. And incorrect use of figures of speech. This also, according to Longinus, is a thing which contributes to false sublime. If we closely look at the views of Longinus, we realize that he seems to be influenced by Plato, by thoughts of the great Plato, master of Aristotle. And as I had already said earlier, On the Sublime is dedicated to an important Roman public figure, Posthumium Terentianus. This was a letter written to him. So here I conclude my discussion of Longinus on the Sublime. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. Tapadia, sir. Am I
Yes, sir.
audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So thank you, Tapadia, sir, for sparing this morning for us from your busy schedule. And it was really very wonderful performance, very simplified poetics and on the sublime. This is for the first time that Dr. Tapadia has accepted our invitation. I don't know why he wasn't that interested earlier, but sir, if you keep on coming in the sessions like this, I am sure that it will be of a big help to students. So once again, for being here with us on behalf of all the organizing colleges, I appreciate your presence here in this session, and declare that we'll be meeting tomorrow next morning for the next session. So thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you, sir.